Hello everyone, welcome back again to another video on middle game strategy, this time on sacrificing on h6. I don't know if anyone really cares about this, but it's always nice to get the first grasp when the sacrifice is just right under your nose. For example, let's look at this position that's already known by many players by heart. Or if not, perhaps this video will help you do something. But in this position, Anatoly Karpov playing black plays queen to e8, which is logical, yes? Trying to pile up the pressure on down to the e file, and then also trying to bring the queen to the king side and protecting some of the light squares that's currently weak at the king side at the moment. But here comes one of the greatest sacrifices in the history of chess made by human. And if you've watched the video that I referred you to, you have known that white here plays knight takes on h6. This is amazing sacrifice. First of all, he understands that the g-pawn cannot take because it's pinned by the bishop, and if the rook takes on h6, then suddenly knight takes d6, the queen is exposed to discover the attack on the e file. The queen can be moved to, let's say, a safe square like b8, where it attacks the knight twice, but then it's too late. Knight to f7 check. This, after king to g8, is a threat of checkmate after the queen is brought to h5. The same threat here is that the pawn cannot take the knight, but after, let's say, knight to d3 to block some of the checks, then we have knight to f7 again. This will be a beautiful checkmate down here on g7, where everybody is working together with the queen to checkmate the king, the lone king here on the king side. So this will be bad for black, and obviously if black takes the knight on d6, then suddenly rook takes on e8. This is winning for us as well. Black can play queen to h5, looking to trade our queens and simply be up material. However, we can really play rook to g5. We're okay with trading the queens. After the queen takes on d1, knight to f7 check, we take on h6, and after taking on d1, it is evident who is actually winning this position. Even after c3 is played in this position, after Kasparov was saying this, we have knight to f7 check. But then after bishop to g6, everything is shut down. Even after pawn takes on b2, winning materials, the bishop on g6 cover h7 f7 square, making it even more difficult for the king to escape. And so already we can play something like rook to h5, literally threatening mate next move. And this will also be kaput for black. The complexity doesn't end there, however. First of all, black doesn't have to take on h6. He can choose to ignore that, which he did in the game by playing pawn to c3, which Kasparov explained is still manageable for him. In the game, knight to f5 was played, and after c takes on b2, it is evident after queen to g4, we can go queen to h4 next. Doesn't really matter if sacrifice a piece, he can get all the heavy pieces in and win by forcing all these major pieces down black's throat. Black responded with bishop to c8, trying to just, maintain the pressure on the queen right here. However, it's all useless and too late. We can see queen to h4 check, and after rook to h6, giving up exchange doesn't really matter as well. Knight h6, pawn h6. We can see the rook controls the g file, the king is stuck in a corner. This is very bad. And the last move that puts black in a coffin is king to h2. This is actually very awesome, getting the king out of the way before, let's say, moving the knight to g5, threatening f7 by the way. Also knight to f6 is possible, trading down knight on the center of the board and check and mating the king on the center, on the corner of the board, excuse me. Black here plays queen to e5 as a response to f6, but however we can see knight to g5, again going to the f7 with a fork. The queen come back to f6, protecting f7 square. However, by bringing the queen to the king side of the board, he realizes that rook to e8 doesn't protect the center of the board anymore, doesn't protect the back rank anymore. And after this, bishop to f5, hoping to, let's say, get the rook involved to protect the back rank. But it no longer matters. As Kasparov explained, he can play queen takes on h6. First of all, the bishop is pinned. But if the queen were to take on h6, then knight to f7 check. This is a beautiful fork. The king to h7. Bishop takes on h5. Doesn't even want to take on the queen on h6. And after, let's say, the queen comes to h6, which is the only square to defend against the mate, then the bishop takes, king g7, rook takes a8. This is already evident that white is already up by a bunch of material. Black doesn't have a hope of promoting the pawn to a queen because the bishop is always here trying to defend. And in few moves, white just went on to win the game when black resigned. This is one of the most phenomenal game played by Kasparov because of the 20 move sacrifice that is calculated within the game, right? Which seems like a seamless sacrifice and that is made by Kasparov. But without the tingling spidey sense that tells him that knight h6 is actually working, I doubt that Kasparov will actually place this sacrifice that will actually end up in YouTube even, decades after he plays it. And so I look up more games that feature sacrificing on h6 and found out some patterns that players can use to basically improvise on the game and judge for themselves, and hopefully down the road can give you this kind of spidey sense as well when the sacrifice is just right under your nose. We categorize these few patterns that we see online to these few sentences that we hope that people can understand better. But in general, as you can see as well, that white really has 3 or more pieces aiming at the king's side, 1 or 2 to sacrifice, while we have another 2 to checkmate black on his camp. Also, we have the double bishop pair right here in the last grip position, aiming as a sniper to the black's position. Also, if you look at any further, black's amount of pieces isn't really in tune to get into the king's side to defend the checkmate or the threat against the black king. And so the only pieces to defend that is the queen and the rook. And once we get over them, we should be able to figure out the sacrifice is working. And we should be able to checkmate black as fast as possible. The second game that we're looking right now is played between Fabiano Caruana and Vladimir Kramnik in the rapid game. However, in this position, black has a gradually worse position because he thought that knight takes d5 is possible and suffice, because the rook that is pinned on e1. But after rook to d1, he probably just realized that knight is sitting stupid on d5, it's going to be taken next. So knight to f4, but white has something in reserve. Queen to c3, threatening to checkmate in 1 on g7, and the only best move that can defend the mate is knight to e6. The problem is, if you notice, we have double bishop here again, threatening to checkmate black. Also, we have rook that is basically pretty poised to be brought to the king's side in it. And so this smells like a sacrifice again on h6, if anything. Fabiano Caruana started with bishop to c2 attacking the queen. The queen moves to c5. Just an awkward square for me, because after it's hit by the rook on c4, the queen comes to g5. But the assault is not enough. Rook to d5. Now sadly, not just one rook, there are 2 rooks that's ready to get into the king's side and do some harm. Queen h4, we see king h2 trying to play g3 next to trap the queen. After pawn to c6 attacking the rook, Fabiano Caruana doesn't even care, plays pawn to g3 attacking the queen. After the queen comes back to e7, which is the most passive square, and also one important key square as well that he did not defend is h6. White comes in with a huge sacrifice, knight takes on h6. Of course, the point is, after the pawn takes h6, it's checkmate on this diagonal. Kramnik of course ignores that by playing king e7, but after knight to f5 attacking the queen as well. It's amazing to know after bishop takes on f5, the pawn takes on f5. If the knight were to move somewhere, this is checkmate, so the knight cannot move. Let's say if the pawn takes on the rook, threatening to take on c4 next, winning more material, then we can ready play pawn takes on e6, that is check. The same way to defend against the check and also g7 is to play f5 himself. But then bishop takes on f5 check. After king to g8, the move rook to h4 is simple enough to win the game, trying to infiltrate on king's side. The next turn we can go queen to, let's say, f3 and h5 the next move, and this will be equally kaput for black. Kramnik just chose one of the best moves in this position to play pawn takes on d5, and after pawn takes on d5, recapturing, we can see clearly the rook is coming to the h4 pretty quickly next turn. There's no stopping it. The queen comes to f6 though, trying to defend against the mate and also trying to trade off the queen. It's useless though. Rook h4 check. First of all, after king to g8, we first see knight h6 again with the same idea. After the pawn takes the queen, we'll be lost on f6, and so king to f8. You probably thought there's nothing that can bring black down anymore, but here white plays bishop to a3 check. This is last nail in the coffin. After knight c5, after everything traded off on c5, the king once again doesn't have enough square to go to. The queen has to go to e7 to protect against the mate. However, knight to f5, sacrificing the queen, by the way. If the queen is to be taken on c5, then rook h8 is checkmate. And so in this position, Vladimir Kramnik just resigns. But in essence, we do see all 3 feature or patterns come up in this game, is that it has many pieces that is aiming at the king's side. Yes, and first of all, yes, bishop attacking on the king's side as well, and also the major pieces that is ready to transfer to the king's side to attack as well. While black's pieces are basically doing nothing on the queen's side, just being a bystander in this position. The third game we have here seems relatively stable though, with all pieces developed. The queen here from white expresses an intention to attack the king on the king's side, and we have the black queen already defending it. However, after a few moves, the bishop to c2 and b4 from black, we do see the following position after bishop to d7, queen h5, and bishop to b4. It's interesting that black doesn't play pawn to g6 to kick away the queen here because of the following sequence. White here can play queen takes on h6 check, and after the king takes on h6, the problem is knight to g4 is a double check, attacks the queen as well. The king comes back to g7. We can take on f6, but there's bishop h6, forcing the king to move. Let's say if the king moves to h7, we can check again. This would be bad for black because he's just losing material. So I suspect that Roland sees that and doesn't play that, plays bishop takes on b4 instead, attacking the rook. Here David Howell just plays an amazing move that uses both this bishop on c2 and h6. He plays knight to d5, firstly attacking the queen and also the knight. If the knight were to exchange itself on d5, which happens in the game, this, as you can see, is a check to the king, and the double bishop pair suddenly becomes very active. However, if black doesn't take, and let's say he plays something like queen to g6 to, let's say, trade off the queen, then white can accept the trade, queen takes g6, and after the pawn takes on g6, to play knight to b4. Remember the bishop here is hanging on b4, and so it's no good to, let's say, trade off the queen and ignore the bishop on b4. And so knight takes d5, pawn takes d5 check. The king has to move away, but suddenly the bishop becomes very active. We see rook to e3 first, getting the bishop out of the attack, and also just getting it to, so they can have easy access on the king's side with rook to f3, rook to g3 of some sort. In this particular position, Roland moves the queen back to e7, but David Howell, being David Howell, doesn't really care about the bishop on c2 anymore because he recognizes how big the attack was on the king's side. Plays bishop takes on h6, sacrificing a bishop, a minor piece. The idea is the same. If pawn takes on h6, then rook to g3 probably falls to some checkmate. And if that doesn't exist, then probably the piece, like the queen, will be lost somewhere in the middle. And so that's no good. Instead, what Roland did was rook takes on c2. However, David continues with the assault, but bishop takes on g7. Again, forcing the black king to take, because after the black king takes, then we have rook to g7 check. Excuse me, I was about to say rook to g3 check. If the queen or the bishop with the block, we simply take, we should be able to win this pretty easily. And so Roland tried a last resort defense, which is pawn to f5. Seems like a good move, attacking the the bishop with the queen. But I simply just pull back, and the threat of rook to g3 is still alive. Rook to c4 by Roland trying to defend the king side, but however, rook to g3, doesn't really matter. Rook to g4 we trade and place queen to g6 check. The king will be forced to the corner, but we play bishop to g5, attacking the queen. If the queen were to move to g7, which seems like it protects everything, then bishop to f6 pins down the queen to the king, and he will have lost the queen. This will be an easy win for white. So this is practically useless to defend. In the end, black just resigns over here, and white takes the win. Now the last game, as the third one, also seems pretty calm for both sides when black plays pawn to h6 and exchanges occurs on e6. Seems pretty okay for black, seems every piece is developed and so on, but white strives for perfect imbalances again by playing pawn to g4. This is just basically saying that I want to push every pawn on the king side to attack you and checkmate you on the king side. Black on the other hand will do the same on the queen side. However, we're going to see which one is faster. Black in this position plays knight to d7, attacking the bishop on e5, but in this position, surprisingly, white doesn't even care about the bishop, and here he plays pawn to h4. This looks crazy because first of all, it sacrifices a pawn, but after bishop takes on h4, young Timman has a plan to play pawn to f4. Now this opens up the queen to the king's side, and major pieces will be flying down the h file right here. G file will be next, and suddenly it's white who is having a major advantage just because sacrifice a pawn opened the h file. That is not to mention, and all the smaller pieces attacking the king's side as well. And so he didn't take that. First of all, he plays pawn to b4 just to see where the knight move. Personally, I would feel that the knight move to a4 is best, still maintaining possibility of pawn to f4 and queen to h2 very quickly. However, after Jan Timman plays knight to e2, Anatoly Karpov recognizes the queen at h2 is no longer possible. He just grabs the pawn. However, the same occurs. pawn to f4 from Timman. Still think that the knight is better placed on a4 so the queen can come to h2 very quickly. However, this is played in the game. Anatoly Karpov continues with the mission after taking the pawn to play pawn to c5. Again, with the same principle that we talked about earlier, is to push all the queenside pawns and to create major advantage on the queen side. Also, the threat next move is to play pawn to d4, where it lines up the rook to the queen right here. But by playing pawn to c5 as well, Anatoly Karpov made something that Timman could have played, and that is bishop to a6. Now, where exactly does the rook move? If he moves to a8, then bishop to b7 traps the rook. If rook to c6, then the same thing occurs. With bishop to b7, that also traps the rook. Rook to b6 doesn't really matter, because we have bishop takes d5. That wins a pawn, if not the rook. This would be a superb position for white to play. So you see that black just ignored the rook by playing bishop back to e7. But after bishop takes on c8 and queen takes on c8, we simply have a very easy plan of bringing all our pieces on the king side and try to checkmate black down the throat. Anatoly Karpov plays pawn to f6 right here, but just as few moves ago, Timman literally doesn't care and plays rook takes on h6. This is also in the idea after the pawn takes on the rook, then the queen comes in with check and there's nothing that can protect the black king. The king to f8, queen h6, the only piece that defends the king in the current moment is the knight here on e6. If we were to come back to g8, then I have knight to f5, now knight to f8 trying to defend the g6 square and h7 square. We do have rook to h1, this falls back to the third principle, which brings every heavy pieces to attack your opponent's king. Checkmate in few moves as well. And so if you think that black king can be defended once again by knight to g7, then the same thing occurs. Knight to h5, pinning down the knight, attacking the knight next move. Rook to d8, but then we can pick up this knight. And in the end of the day, it's a checkmate on the center of the board. And so this is no good for black. Even though you can see the checkmate, you can see that black is very bad. And so in the end, the rook is not taken on h6. Instead, plays knight to f8, which defends the square on h7 and g6. The rook comes to h3 though, and you can see that who is open for business is the h-file to attack right here. There's really no stopping all these major pieces to come to h-file and attack the black king. So after pawn to c4 trying to cause chaos in white's position, everything's useless though after rook to h1. It is rather impossible for black to play queen to h6 to defend, because the knight can just take. He plays knight to g6 though, to prevent the rook h8 checkmate kind of stuff, but knight to d6 attacking the knight on g6, knight d to f8, defending the knight on g6, but then lose the rook on d8, rook to h5. Although everything kind of fizzles out from here on out, white really has enough material to pick up every pawn that black has on his on his king side, and use all these remaining pawns to push and get a queen. I apologize that I started a lot in the end of the day, but these are basically the games I want to show you today. Hopefully they deliver some of the patterns that I promised to deliver. Hopefully you can find this in your game as well. Hopefully you can apply this in your game and win some games in a cool fashion. At the end of the day, if you enjoyed the video a lot, I'll appreciate it if you press the like button as a sign of support. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Thank you.